This is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Aurora Green. I'll be testing it in a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib, and I'm going to begin with the Extra Fine. This is a Pilot 78G Plus with an extra fine nib, extra fine steel nib. And this feels very nice. Considering it's an extra fine nib, it's not wanting to hang up on the paper. I don't feel any scratchiness. There is a significant amount of feedback because the nib is so fine, but a very usable combination. Next, I have a Pilot Pereira with a fine steel nib. This is noticeably smoother. Still not what most people would typically call smooth, but very pleasant to use. I'll put an exclamation point. It's a little more pleasant than the extra fine, but depending on how fine of a line you need, both of those are very usable. Next, I have a Pilot Custom 74 with 14 karat fine nib. This nib usually applies more ink to the page. Now, this I would actually consider smooth. And notice how much more ink it's putting down. And this nib, if you can kind of see in the little loops you see, and on the P here, you see a little bit of line variation. That's not from me pressing down, that's just the way the feed allows the ink to flow. You get more line variation and color variation with that 14 karat fine nib. Next, I have a Quebeco Percheo with a medium nib, and I've said before that this nib has feedback, but it's smooth. But I want you to see if you can hear the nib as I write. For a medium nib that feels this smooth, it makes quite a bit of noise. So that gives, I've always thought, oh, there's some feedback here because of the scratching I'm hearing on the paper. But this is actually very smooth and pleasant to write with. But you do hear the nib on the page. This is another nib that is nice if you want to see some the shading of an ink. If you have an ink that has some nice shading, that will really show it off well. As well, this next pen, the Pilot Metropolitan with the cursive medium nib. This is another good pen to use for inks that shade. Again, very smooth, very enjoyable writing experience, especially with these last 3 nibs. Very smooth. This Aurora Green is very similar to Monteverde Green. They both flow nicely. They're similar color greens. They have a similar amount of shading, and might be able to see later some of the red sheen. Next I have a Nemesis Singularity with a 0.6 stub nib. Very smooth. Very wet. I'm going to go ahead and put, because this was even more smooth than the previous nibs. And this nib, it's a stub nib, but it's, if you can see, there's no tipping, and it's just perfectly, the end is perfectly rounded. I really enjoy using that nib, especially when I'm wanting to see any interesting characteristics that ink might have. And finally, I've got the Jinhao X750 with a 1.5 stub nib. I apologize for my lighting today. It's cloudy. It looks like it's going to rain. So I don't have any natural sunlight. All right. Now, while this dries, I've got some writing samples on various other papers that we can take a look at. This is my little ARC notebook. The first two, the extra fine and the fine, I labeled were very nice, very smooth. The others were too, but this ink, it didn't soak into the paper too quickly, but it felt like this paper is somewhat absorbent, so I could still feel the ink spreading a little bit. Now my stub nib, it soaked in pretty quickly, and it didn't look like, it's not really wanting to feather, but especially even like on my Custom 74, it puts down a decent amount of ink, but some letters are really fat and some of the other letters are really thin, so I preferred the fine nibs, and I thought they looked really good. Let's see. Yeah, as far as bleeding through the paper, I'm seeing a decent amount of show through, but this is like a dark, vibrant ink. The bleeding wasn't very bad at all. On my Rhodia paper, the fine nibs were nice. They were smooth. The others were nice as usual. I had to re-dip my stub nib. And you noticed on this one, the stub nib was kind of thin. I'm not sure why that is. Now, I do these writing samples by dipping, so I don't know if this absorbent paper really sucked a lot of the ink out of the nib, and then when I went to do this one, there wasn't much ink left. That's a possibility, but very pleasant to write with, and all the nibs. On my 20-pound copy paper, notice the ink soaked into the paper very quickly. So my fine nibs were the most pleasant to use. Let's see, my stub nib and my wetter nibs, you can really see how the inks wanted to spread. So it wasn't quite as pleasant to use. On poor quality paper, the fine nibs are the way to go. On good quality paper, you have all kinds of options. All the nibs were pleasant. And you can kind of see here, a little more of the blue is showing up in my viewfinder. It's looking a little more minty green than it is in real life. In real life, this is more of a grassy green, and that's just because of my lighting. But I used the 1.5 stub nib up here. I don't know if, yeah, there you can see on the heavier areas, you have a little bit of red sheen, sometimes a little halo of red sheen, and it really shows up when you get into the medium nibs. Now, I don't know if you'll be able to see it here, but starting with the Percheo, I'm seeing just little bits of red sheen in the heavier bits where the ink laid down heavier. It's just really nice. It's not an overwhelming amount of sheen, but just very nice. Oh, I didn't show my writing sample in the Leuchtturm. Just looks really nice on this off-white paper. Very pleasant. It was a little bit drier there also. I think this ink is just so flowy that in really wet nibs, the ink just, since I dipped this, I had less ink in the nib. So, just a really good overall ink. Very comparable to Monteverde Green. They're slightly different colors. When I did my green ink comparison, you could see that you really have to have them right beside each other to be able to tell the difference, but there is a slight difference between the two greens, but they perform very similarly. So if you have one or the other, it's not really a situation where you need both inks. But I'm on a green kick here lately, so I'm really enjoying this pretty green Aurora Green. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.